There's nothing more exhilarating than pointing out the shortcomings of others, is there?
This video was made possible due to those who support me on Patreon. Thank you all for your support. So several months ago, I was in a session with my therapist when she stated that the issues I was struggling with seemed to be in line with that of attention deficit disorder, aka ADD, and that she would like me to see a specialist. And I was like, no, I struggle with racing thoughts, an inability to focus on tasks, trouble listening without getting distracted, and my short-term memory being shot to shit. And she was like, yeah, I'd really like you to see a specialist. Pfft, whatever. So I see the specialist and I'm like, bruh, I don't have ADD. And he was like, well, here's what ADD is. Oh. Well, shit. When I was first introduced to the possibility of having ADD, I was pretty averse, as you could tell. However, this was only because I had no idea what ADD really was or how it manifested in behavior. Well, I thought I did. I mean, I wasn't a student of mental health or psychology or anything bougie like that. Rather, my knowledge of the disorder was derived from the most trustworthy educational tool there is and ever will be. It wasn't until my own diagnosis that I realized my entire perception of the disorder was based on how it was portrayed in media. And not just for ADD, bipolar disorder, obsessive compulsive disorder, dissociative identity disorder, all disorders that my knowledge of was shaped primarily by their portrayal in movies, television, what have you. I would venture to guess this is the case for many of you watching, which isn't anything to be embarrassed about. Unless you or someone close to you has dealt with one of these disorders, it is unlikely that you would have any direct experience with them, and thus, media may be your sole reference point. However, now the question is, how accurate are these depictions? How does someone watching a movie with a character who is said to have, say, schizophrenia, know if said disorder is being depicted accurately? And if not, does this run the risk of spreading misconceptions about and/or reinforcing social stigma towards those with the disorder? And thus, welcome to the first episode in my Media Misdiagnosis series, with each episode discussing a single psychiatric disorder, examining how the disorder is portrayed in mainstream media, and analyzing how accurately said disorder is depicted, dispelling common misconceptions and misunderstandings. Today we will discuss the disorder that inspired this series, ADD, aka Attention Deficit Disorder. To begin, it would be advisable to establish what precisely attention deficit disorder is and how it manifests in behavior. For a detailed breakdown, I recommend Understood's video featuring Dr. Thomas E. Brown, who gives a comprehensive explanation of the disorder. However, I'd like to offer you a simple metaphor to give you an idea of what having ADD is like. I actually came across a version of this on a Reddit thread a while back, but was unable to locate it when I was scripting this video. So credit goes to said Redditor, and if anyone's able to find said thread, please let me know. So let's say you get home after a hard day's work and plop down on the couch to watch some TV. You grab the remote and start flipping through the channels. You stay on the channel for a few seconds to see if it's something you dig, decide it's not, and keep channel surfing. Eventually settling on something you like, and you're good to go. This is how the average non-ADD person manages their thoughts and tasks. Their mind, of course, can jump from thought to thought, task to task, get bored, but when it comes to something they want or need to take care of, they can focus their attention and see it to completion. However, now let's say the channel button gets stuck, so the TV starts changing channels on its own. You may see something you want to watch, but you can't stop the channel from changing, only getting short glimpses of each program as it continues over and over and over. This is how someone with ADD feels when trying to focus on a particular task. Even if it is something they want or need to focus on, they are incapable of doing so for an extended period of time, as if their mind just keeps changing the channel on them. As you can imagine, this can royally fuck your shit up. Let's say you're in a work meeting and your boss is explaining to you the details of some upcoming important project, but your attention jumps to the pupper you see walking past the window, but only for a short time before it then jumps to you noticing one of your coworkers has a stain on his shirt. But then all of a sudden, you start thinking about some trailer for a shitty early 2000s comedy you saw like 10 years ago, and then you finally snap back to your boss only to realize you didn't recollect anything they said. The more severe the jumping around, the more difficulties may arise, struggles with maintaining relationships, missing work deadlines, thus giving a disorder that is often laughed off as a minor inconvenience the potential to be significantly life-altering, if not destructive. Now, there are certain circumstances where a person with ADD is able to focus on a particular task, such as when some sort of pressure or anxiety is present. When I was in high school, I could never bring myself to sit down and work on an English essay that my teacher gave me 4 weeks to do until literally the night before. But then I would be able to bang it out in like 2 or 3 hours and ace the fucker. I just thought I was a lazy piece of shit. And in many regards I am, but in this case, I was using the fear of fucking up the assignment and or the shame of letting my teacher or myself down as a stimulant, if you will, which allowed my brain to kick itself into gear and get my shit done. Note that I used the word stimulant. We will be revisiting this very shortly. However, this of course can be destructive in and of itself, as while using auxiliary pressure or feelings of guilt to motivate oneself may allow you to get some stuff done, this clearly is not a healthy long-term strategy to manage your daily tasks and work. Another circumstance is if a particular task is something that greatly interests an individual. For me, that's writing and making YouTube videos. Editing my latest video essay for 8 hours straight, no sweat. My boss asks me to send an email to our office manager to order more hand soap for the bathroom. You're lucky if I get to that shit by the end of the week. However, this can lead to tunnel vision like levels of focus. I might be able to focus intently on editing, but that might result in me forgetting that I also had a lasagna in the oven and oh fuck. While this might seem counterintuitive, it actually makes perfect sense when you consider ADD isn't so much a lack of focus, but an inability to manage said focus. Sometimes you are so unfocused, you can't do anything. Sometimes you are so honed in on one thing, you forget everything else. And both of these situations can lead to trouble. So we've discussed what ADD is. However, now you may be thinking, hang on, you keep saying ADD, but what about ADHD? Are they different? Yes and no. The terms are commonly used to denote the two main ways the disorder manifests itself in behavior: inattentive and hyperactive impulsive. Someone who displays hyperactive impulsive behavior, which would denote someone with ADHD, attention deficit hyperactivity disorder, would be hyperactive and impulsive, obviously, impatient, fidgety, sort of the bouncing off the walls type. It is this manifestation of the disorder that is most commonly found in media. Characters with an official ADHD diagnosis, such as Tracy from 30 Rock, Barney from How I Met Your Mother, Alan from the Hangover trilogy, Juno from Juno, and those without an official diagnosis but appear to demonstrate symptoms in line with the disorder, such as Tigger from Winnie the Pooh, are all characterized as rambunctious, unpredictable, and quirky. However, rather than the actual symptomatology of ADHD being discussed, the disorder is often used as more of just a vague umbrella term to denote a character who has a random or irreverent disposition, which isn't exactly accurate or appropriate, since there are plenty of people who act like this and don't have ADHD. While characterizing this behavior as ADHD-like might seem harmless, not explaining why the disorder leads to said behavior can warp the perception of its diagnosis, which, as we will soon discuss, can lead to serious and even dangerous consequences. One of the more informative depictions of the disorder can be found in season 1 of Modern Family. The characters of Phil Dunphy and his son Luke are both portrayed as demonstrating ADHD symptomatology while trying to complete Luke's school project. Luke displays an inability to remain focused on the task at hand, his mind easily wandering off.
I see the wheels spinning. The spark of
How did they
creativity.
get the lead and pencils?
Phil is shown to impulsively jump from task to task, even if the previous tasks remain unfinished, or if doing so results in him having less regard for his own safety. While it's only ever insinuated that Phil and Luke have ADHD in this one episode, it deserves some credit for discussing actual symptoms of the disorder and the difficulties they can lead to, such as Luke struggling to complete his schoolwork and Phil's impulsivity leading to injury. However, and this applies to every other character I've mentioned thus far, the behavior is almost always played for laughs, which in turn leads to ADHD not being perceived as a potentially detrimental disorder. An extremely rare instance of it being treated in a serious manner can be found in ABC Family's The Fosters. In season 1, it is revealed that the character of Jesus has ADHD, but in contrast to most depictions that play it for laughs, the show demonstrates how Jesus' ADHD leads to severe consequences, such as failing classes and his impulsivity, which makes it difficult for him to manage his emotions, making him lash out in a violent manner. While there are many depictions of the hyperactive impulsive manifestation, some more accurate and thoughtful than others, the other is rarely ever portrayed, and that is the inattentive manifestation, which is characterized by the same symptoms as ADHD: difficulty focusing, easily getting distracted, trouble getting started on and following through with tasks, but it just doesn't manifest itself as hyperactive or impulsive behavior. So yeah, basically ADHD without the H. Today, ADD is considered an outdated term and is referred to as ADHD PI, the PI standing for predominantly inattentive. However, for the sake of this video, I'm going to use ADD to denote the inattentive manifestation and ADHD to denote the hyperactive impulsive manifestation. Before my own diagnosis, I had difficulties with organization and staying focused, but since I wasn't bouncing off the walls or behaving like a quirky, kooky rascal, I didn't think it was ADD, as I assumed hyperactivity was an essential component, which is one of the biggest misconceptions about the disorder. Due to my inability to focus, I found it difficult to get started on or follow through with tasks. Thus, I would get stressed and frustrated about all the stuff I needed to get done. The more it piled up, the more stressed I got, which would often lead to me just spacing out on the couch, simultaneously unable to get started on anything while freaking out about all the things I wasn't getting started on. Now, it would appear that my symptomatology on the surface was more in line with anxiety depression, which is what I thought I was struggling with for a long time. And to some extent I was, but it was as a result of my ADD. In the past, I had been put on antidepressants and benzodiazepines for anxiety, but I didn't see any significant improvement in my life until I began medication and treatment specifically catered for ADD. And in light of this, I just want to note two things before we continue. 1. Many psychological disorders, via their symptomatology, may resemble one another, as most are related to imbalances in one's brain chemistry and/or functioning. When someone is diagnosed with a disorder, it is simply that they seem to lean towards said particular disorder. Thus, their diagnosis may be amended depending on how they respond to certain treatments and whether or not their symptomatology changes over time. It isn't as simple as drawing blood and observing it under a microscope. It is a very flexible and ongoing process. This is even true when it comes to ADD and ADHD. Instead of thinking of them as two completely separate disorders, it's better to think of them as different manifestations of the same disorder, with certain individuals exhibiting some symptoms more prominently than others. A person may primarily exhibit inattentive as opposed to hyperactive impulsive symptomatology, and vice versa. But that doesn't mean there isn't any crossover. In fact, most people with the disorder present some mix of both inattentive and hyperactive impulsive symptomatology. It's more appropriate to think of the disorder as a spectrum in that regard. And because of this, too, do not use this video or media in general to diagnose yourself. As I said, media may be one's only point of reference in regard to certain disorders, and some depictions may even give you an inkling that you may be struggling with something similar. But if you believe you may be struggling with a disorder of some kind, make sure to consult with a mental health professional. It could be dangerous to diagnose yourself and even take steps towards certain forms of self-medication, which isn't advisable in and of itself, but which also might exacerbate your symptoms. I repeat, always consult with a professional if you believe you are struggling with any mental health issues. So we've gone over the difference between ADD and ADHD, and how ADHD, while far more commonly found in media, is often played for laughs, and its more destructive side effects are rarely highlighted. So now let's move on to how treatment of the disorder is portrayed. Depending on the severity, many who struggle with ADD and ADHD may benefit from simple behavioral modifications. application: meditation, journaling, organizational strategies, anger stress management skills, etc. However, medication may be necessary for those with moderate to severe ADD or ADHD, when behavioral changes simply are not enough. The most common drugs used to treat the disorder are what are known as stimulants. Told you I'd get back to this. Some of the most common brand names for drugs of this kind are Ritalin and Adderall, which I am sure ring a few bells. However, now I'm sure some of you are asking, wait, why would a stimulant help people with ADD or ADHD? Wouldn't it only make one's mind more scattershot? In order to demonstrate why this is not the case, let's use another media example. In season 1 of Degrassi: The Next Generation, the character Spinner Mason has diagnosed ADHD. He offers his friend Jimmy Brooks one of his Ritalin pills in order for Jimmy to manage both basketball and his schoolwork. Upon missing his Ritalin, Spinner engages in hyperactive and impulsive behavior, while Jimmy becomes incredibly hyper and aggressive. As a kid, I didn't understand why the medication would have these effects on these two boys. I'm not going to go too deep into the chemistry of how stimulants work, but I'll link some resources in the description for a more detailed breakdown. For now, I'll stick with a simple demonstration. So the triangle you see on screen is meant to represent one's level of control of their executive functioning, a term used to denote a number of mental functions that allows one to, well, function. Memory, focus, emotional management. To put it simply, it is the level of control you have over your mental functions and your ability to keep them focused in a sense. People who have ADD or ADHD have less control over these functions, which in turn results in a lack of focus, bad memory, and emotional dysregulation, or for those with ADHD, hyperactivity and impulsivity. So let's say the average person is right about here in the middle, which is to say they have a normal amount of control over their executive functioning. So someone who has ADD or ADHD would be down here. Stimulants such as Ritalin or Adderall improve this individual's control over their executive functioning, bringing it to a manageable level, thus allowing them to focus on tasks and get things done and or make them less hyper or impulsive. But what if someone without ADD or ADHD takes a stimulant? Well, obviously this will vary from person to person, but most likely they will receive a large boost of energy and become even more hyper-focused, which is why you have probably heard of Adderall being used by college kids to cram for tests or to write papers. Well, damn, that sounds pretty sweet. If taking these drugs raises your executive functioning, why doesn't everyone take them and become fucking Bradley Cooper from Limitless? Well, let me put it like this. If you were conducting an experiment in chemistry class, you wouldn't just take a random chemical and mix it with another without knowing what they are and how they interact, right? Precisely.
So why the fuck would you do that with your fucking brain?
If someone has an average level of control over their executive functioning, that means their brain is working as it should. There is balance. People with ADD or ADHD need stimulants to help them attain that balance. But if someone without ADD or ADHD takes a stimulant, they are, in effect, purposefully messing with said balance. Stimulants like this are not sold over the counter for a reason. They are extremely powerful substances that affect both your brain chemistry and central nervous system. When used by someone who actually needs it, under the supervision of a physician, of course, who can prescribe the proper dosage, it can be life-changing. When used without a prescription by someone who doesn't need it, it can spell disaster. Numerous studies have shown that the misuse of these drugs can have devastating side effects, resulting in one's executive functioning getting thrown out of whack, which can lead to manic episodes, psychotic episodes, panic attacks, hallucinations, depression, seizures, paranoia, insomnia, just to name a few. In Degrassi, even though the Ritalin helps Spinner, who has ADHD, with his impulse control, it actually ends up inhibiting Jimmy's, demonstrated when he becomes incredibly aggressive to the point where he injures his own teammate. Hell, it's even been shown that the misuse of Adderall, despite its use by college-age kids to boost academic performance, can actually have the opposite effect. And that is just in the short term. Prolonged misuse can lead to dependency, resulting in long-lasting, if not permanent effects on your body and mind. And just keep in mind, I'm talking about adults with fully developed brains. Imagine the devastating effects the misuse of these drugs can have on young adults, God forbid adolescents. Could you imagine if we just gave this shit to kids who didn't have the disorder, like we were giving out Halloween candy?
You said a mouthful.
While Bart Simpson could be said to be a clear-as-day representation of the ADHD adolescent, he's incredibly impulsive, unruly, disruptive, chaotic. He wasn't actually diagnosed with the disorder until the second episode of season 11. After Bart causes mayhem during Springfield Elementary's fire prevention assembly, he is diagnosed with ADD and is put on an experimental new drug called Focusin. While Bart's behavior initially improves, he becomes less disruptive, more productive. He eventually displays extreme paranoia, believing that Major League Baseball is spying on the citizens of Springfield via an orbiting satellite. He ends up being correct, but I digress. South Park has a similar episode in which the whole gang feigns ADD to get out of doing their schoolwork, and are all put on Ritalin after they undergo an incredibly rigorous and comprehensive evaluation.
All right now, in Chapter 12, what kind of bottles did Miss Van Kampen talk about? My God, these children all have ADD!
Hooray.
Now at first glance, both episodes may seem to be critical of medicating kids for ADD, ADHD, and to downplay the seriousness of the disorder. However, it is extremely important to put these episodes into proper context. Both of these episodes were released within a year of one another in 1999-2000. During the preceding decade, the number of children diagnosed with ADD and ADHD skyrocketed. By 1995 alone, 1.5 million US children between the ages of 5 and 18 were on some sort of stimulant medication. Now, while the rise in the diagnosis rate was in part due to the scientific community's growing understanding of the disorder, and thus they were able to better diagnose it, it was also driven by its rampant and careless overdiagnosis. Remember earlier how I mentioned that just slapping the label of ADHD on a character who is kooky or quirky or rambunctious can actually lead to dangerous consequences? This is what I was talking about. ADD and ADHD are much easier to diagnose in adults, since an adult is able to communicate the extent to which their executive functioning is being inhibited. This is what differentiates someone who is struggling with the disorder and someone who is just lazy or lacks work ethic. But when we are talking about kids, now things get a little tricky. So let's say there is a 10-year-old kid who is causing disruption in his classroom. He's unruly, impatient, he can't sit still, has trouble listening and paying attention. Well, this kid must clearly have ADHD, right? Or maybe his disruptions are as a result of behavioral issues. Maybe his parents just aren't properly disciplining him at home. Maybe it has something to do with the classroom curriculum requiring the kid to sit on his ass for hours at a time with limited socializing and recess breaks. Maybe the kid's just bored because he's forced to sit quietly while the teacher lectures the students without any sort of engagement via activities or games. Or maybe he would be willing to just sit and listen to the teacher if his class's reading list included books about stuff he was actually interested in or could at least relate to, instead of the same boring ass drivel that every fucking school in the fucking country makes kids fucking read. While knowledge and understanding about the disorder did improve during this time period, so did the awareness of the disorder among parents and schools. At the time, one of the first steps in the diagnosis process was to complete a pencil paper diagnostic exam, a form that would be filled out not by the kids themselves, of course, but by school officials or the kids' parents, and thus they were at the mercy of observational subjectivity and confirmation bias. And due to their lack of understanding of the disorder and some maybe shady practices by Big Pharma, the misdiagnosis of ADD and ADHD began to skyrocket, with every kid, some as young as 5 years old, who may have been a bit rowdy and unruly, being put on a powerful mind-altering medication like Ritalin that they didn't need, which in turn resulted in God knows what effects on their developing brains.
Mr. Pharmacist, this Ritalin doesn't have any side effects, does it?
Oh, no. Your son may experience a small lack of energy, but that's all.
All right.
Oh, and he might start seeing little pink Christina Aguilera monsters, but that's to be expected.
Oh, my.
The Simpsons and South Park weren't saying ADHD wasn't real or shouldn't be taken seriously. The Simpsons in particular was very empathetic to Bart's ADHD symptomatology in earlier seasons. While he wasn't officially diagnosed until later on, earlier episodes display how the disorder can be detrimental and in some cases sadly disheartening to kids who try their best to succeed. Check out the Cantinas video on this listed in the description. Both shows were actually saying, no, it is a real condition and it should be taken seriously, and thus the flippant diagnosis and medicating of tens of thousands of children who may just have behavioral problems or were given boring ass shit to read over summer break is incredibly dangerous and irresponsible, even if it was done with good intentions. However, sadly, this plea wasn't received the way it was intended to be, leading to the worst side effect of all that came as a result of this period, which was simply the belief that the disorder wasn't that big of a deal, or for some, that it wasn't real at all. Some believed the disorder itself was mostly manufactured or even one giant big pharma hoax, which even led to federal class action lawsuits in the early 2000s. While these lawsuits were all either dismissed or withdrawn, the sentiment of ADD and ADHD being made up, or at the very least extremely overblown, continues to this day, with it being seen as less of a potentially life-altering disorder and more of a quirk, or just an excuse people use to justify laziness. And yet, ironically, the misdiagnosis of ADD and ADHD is still prevalent to this day, as is the misprescribing of medication for adults and children, some as young as 3 years old. And thus the public's current perception of ADD and ADHD is a treacherous one, being simultaneously overdiagnosed, misdiagnosed, not taken seriously, and severely misunderstood. As I stated, it isn't advisable to take one's knowledge of a psychiatric disorder from movies and television. Yet whether we like it or not, media portrayals do shape the public's perception of these disorders, and thus it is important that we see more accurate and informative depictions of ADD and ADHD in the media, as most, with some notable exceptions, not only are somewhat misleading about the symptomatology, but portray it as something that is more of a quirk as opposed to a life-altering disorder. I would love to see more depictions that portray the disorder in a more serious manner, showing the ways in which it can be debilitating and even dangerous, and highlighting the dangers of needlessly prescribing someone medication or using said medication recreationally. Hopefully it will lead to a better understanding of the disorder in the eye of the public. Thank you for checking out this episode of Media Misdiagnosis. Make sure to tune in next episode where we will be discussing bipolar disorder. Thank you all for your support. Consider supporting me on Patreon if you enjoy my content, and I'll see you next time.